The story you are about to hear is the most disturbing social experiment ever conducted in the history of psychology. A human cruelty story in which young boys who were supposed to be pretend prisoners became actual prisoners. This is the story of the Stanford Prison Experiment. A Stanford professor by the name of Philip Zimbardo decided to create a simulated prison environment where young men would act out the roles of guards and prisoners in order to answer these questions. But this controlled experiment began to spiral out of control, as severe acts of cruelty and trauma started to happen, resulting in the termination of the experiment after 6 days, instead of the agreed-upon 14. So what happened? In August 1971, the lecture halls of Stanford saw a student by the name of David Jaffe try to create a mock prison environment with his classmates. These students role-played as prisoners and guards, and created rules that the guards could enforce. This mock experiment was overseen by Philip Zimbardo, and it inspired him to conduct this experiment on a much larger scale. Zimbardo wanted to understand the power roles, rules, and symbols, as well as the group identities that are formed in a prison. Zimbardo applied for a grant, which was funded by the Office of Naval Research at the time. The experiment was greenlit, a venue was set, the minutiae was ironed out, and now all they needed were participants. Like any sane person would do when they're looking for services, Zimbardo and his team placed an ad, except this wasn't on Craigslist. Rather, it was in the Help Wanted section of the school's newspaper, with the ad requesting male college students and $15 incentive per day for 14 days or 2 weeks. This would make an aggregate of $210, which is equivalent to $1,500 in current times. As you can imagine, a lot of people wanted to participate, and about 75 people applied for the study. Zimbardo sought to select some of the more relatively sound and able-bodied young men, those with stable minds and no history of mental illness. This in turn led to 24 boys being chosen for the study. 12 would be guards and 12 would be prisoners. A flip of a coin would determine who would be which, and when this was decided, these boys signed a contract that gave the coordinators the right to infringe on some of their basic human rights throughout the experiment. They had no idea what was coming their way. It should be noted that it was agreed that the guards would not hit them, but they would use any means they saw fit to psychologically lambaste them. And so, the date for the experiment was set. Mock prisons were created by converting the offices of some graduate students into cells, with steel bars mounted on the doors of the offices. A closet was meant for solitary confinement, a small corridor for the yard, and a bigger room across the hall was chosen as the warden and guard station. When that was out of the way, the experiment could begin. The experiment began on August 15, 1971. To pick up the prisoners, actual police officers were sent to arrest them in their respective locations to create the sense of a convicted felon. It should be noted that the boys were not informed of this development, and this was actually in breach of the contracts they signed, but no one complained. It was all part of the experience, or so they thought. They were processed like actual criminals, with mugshots and fingerprints, and then transported to the Stanford Basement Penitentiary. They were stripped naked and sprayed with water. They were compelled to wear stocking caps over their heads and rubber sandals, and then they were given smocks as prison garments with nothing underneath, and the smocks had numbers assigned to them. They were only to be addressed by their numbers and not their names. They even had to wear chains around their ankles to reinforce the notion that they were prisoners and could not escape. By now, you're already starting to get a sense of the ordeal that these boys were in, but it gets so much worse. Day 1. The guards were dressed in outfits similar to prison guards at the time, with khaki shirts and pants. They were also given sunglasses to prevent them from making eye contact with the inmates, as well as to create a sense of anonymity, and of course, a baton and whistle for good measure. They were also meant to work in shifts, 3 guards at a time, while the other 8 guards were on standby. The guards were instructed to thoroughly demean the prisoners, render them submissive, disrespect them, and make them feel unheard. Zimbardo also immersed himself in the experiment by acting out the role of superintendent, and his student David Jaffe played the role of warden. With the rules of the prison presented to them, the inmates retired to their cells for the rest of the first day of the experiment. Day 2. The guards had started their treatment of the prisoners by banging on steel bars and blowing their whistles by 2 a.m. The prisoners started to rebel, barricaded themselves in their cells, and refused to leave their cells to eat in the yard. They ripped off their inmate number tags, took off their stocking caps, and insulted the guards. The guards proceeded to spray the boys with fire extinguisher. They called in more guards and removed the clothes of the prisoners, as well as their mattresses and blankets, and sent some of the prisoners to solitary confinement, or the hole as it was commonly called. They even gave them little to no food to eat. It seems a little extreme for something that was just supposed to be an experiment, and as you can imagine, the prisoners were not happy with this development, but the guards were just getting started. They set up a privilege cell, where the most cooperative prisoners got their clothes and bed back and were allowed to wash, brush their teeth, eat, and sleep. This was all to sow contempt and foster disunity among prisoners. They even made the prisoners do push-ups arbitrarily and restricted bathroom access, forcing them to relieve themselves in buckets and make sure the prisoners could not empty the contents of their buckets, so their cells started to smell. Most of them had to sleep on the floor with little to no food to eat. And remember, this was just day 2 of the experiment. Day 3. Guards were allowed to abuse their power to humiliate the inmates. They forced the prisoners to line up, memorize their numbers, and do push-ups and chores like cleaning the toilet in the middle of the night. The guards put paper bags on the prisoners as they walked around, just one of the many dehumanizing tactics. Due to this effect, one of the inmates, Douglas Corpy, prisoner 8612, began screaming uncontrollably. He had an apparent mental breakdown in which he yelled, "Jesus Christ, I'm burning up inside, I can't stand another night, I just can't take it anymore." Upon seeing his suffering, research assistant Craig Haney immediately released 8612. In an interview in 2017, Corpy confessed that he was just acting, that he only did this because he had a test to study for and the guards would not let him study. But Zimbardo believes Corpy's interview was a lie. In 1992, in a documentary film about the study, Corpy asserted that prison experiment had deeply affected him, and that the experience led to Corpy later becoming a prison psychologist. Day 4. Rumors soon spread that prisoner 8612, who had been released following his outburst, was arranging a prison break to free the prisoners. When Zimbardo caught wind of the plan, he let the guards blindfold the prisoners and let them go to a different floor. Zimbardo waited all night, but the prison break never happened. Like his study participants, Zimbardo seemed to have blurred the lines between reality and make-believe by acting like a real-world prison superintendent. One of the inmates, prisoner 819, was so heavily distressed and started crying uncontrollably. He was then taken to Zimbardo. When he was first asked if he wanted to leave, he refused, saying he didn't want to be a bad prisoner. Zimbardo was surprised because 819 had started to think of himself as an actual prisoner. He reassured him that he was not a prisoner, and after much cajoling, 819 left, and while he was leaving, the guards and other inmates chant, "819 is a bad prisoner." Day 5. The day was scheduled for visitations by friend and family of the inmates in order to simulate the prison experiments. Inmates were properly fed and dressed for the first time in days before they met their parents. Seeing the distress of the kids, some parents left with plans to contact lawyers to gain the early release of their children. It was not until Christina Maslach, an honor student and Zimbardo's love interest, came to examine the experiment that she was appalled by the way the guards were treating the prisoners. She noted that Zimbardo had been so changed by his role as the superintendent, he could not see the cruelty, even though he had been absorbed by the role he was playing. Little by little, all parties involved started getting lost in character, which resulted in the actual suffering of the inmates. Day 6. Zimbardo finally came to his senses and called off the experiment. He also paid all the boys in full for 14 days, and requested that they all come back a week later to recount their experience. And so, the experiment ended, and since then it has suffered a lot of criticism, with many questioning the unethical behavior of Zimbardo and the validity of the results of the experiments. But what concerns a lot of people is how easily the guards were able to maltreat the inmates. They did not need much convincing. They just acted out their roles without guilt, at least during the experiment. The Stanford Prison Experiment has inspired a lot of movies and documentaries in popular culture, prompting a low-budget motion picture adaptation in 2015 under the same name. Zimbardo strongly affirms the validity of the experiment despite its shortcomings, and even published a book inspired by the Stanford Prison Experiment called The Lucifer Effect: Understanding How Good People Turn Evil. He is now a professor emeritus at Palo Alto University, where he teaches social psychology. Some argue that the Stanford Prison Experiment is a travesty, But whether you agree or not, it is known as the most unethical psychological experiment in history.